One of the most shocking changes that Henry VIII made to religion in England was the dissolutions of the monasteries. He and Thomas Cromwell changed the face of English worship forever, as the king sought to divorce his first wife Catherine of Aragon and then marry Anne Boleyn. He split from the Pope, as he would not grant him his divorce, and during the dissolutions, thousands of monks and nuns were made homeless and lost their ways of life. The religious houses were closed all over England, and the riches of the monasteries and abbeys were seized by the king and were taken by the crown to fund Henry VIII's European wars. But in the north of England there was a significant protest against the king and his dissolution, and there were calls for him to revert his changes. But during this time period, there was a huge degree of execution across the country, especially of those men and women who refused to conform to the changes. One of the men who suffered greatly was the Abbot of Woburn Abbey, Robert Hobbes, who was brutally killed on the orders of the infamous Tudor king. Join us today as we look at this, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Robert Hobbes was born around 1480, and little is known about his early life and childhood. But he became the Abbey of Woburn Abbey in 1524, after he would have been voted for by other monks. Inside of these abbeys, the monks were very pious, and they followed strictly the teachings of the monastery, and usually abbots were considered the most devoted. The abbot's role was to run the abbey and the monastery, and Robert Hobbes was in charge of making sure that at Woburn the religious order's rules were kept, and that good routines were established adhering to the teachings and rules of the church. On the 27th of January 1530, after being there for 6 years, Hobbes received a royal licence for the Cistercian Woburn Abbey, and he was then allowed to hold 2 yearly fairs in the town. These were the highlights of the year in the local area, and it brought the people of the monastery closer to the locals. But on the 6th of April 1532, Robert Hobbes was also asked by Henry VIII to allow inspections of his order within the monastery, and at this time Henry VIII was growing rather tired of his first wife Catherine of Aragon. Their marriage was around 20 years in length, and it had not produced a son that Henry VIII greatly craved and wanted. His eye had been captured by Anne Boleyn, a younger woman at court, who Henry greatly wanted to sleep with. But Anne's refusal to take the king's bed, without the problem of his first marriage being solved, caused issue, and ultimately Anne wanted to become the Queen of England in her own right. Because she refused to engage in relations with Henry VIII, the king, he then petitioned the Pope to allow him to annul or divorce Catherine of Aragon. The Pope refused to do this, and was rather obstinate against the issue, and because of this Henry VIII was convinced to declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and outlaw the Pope's authority in the country. Henry could now do what he wanted in terms of religion, and he said the Pope had no power or rule in England, and then in November 1534 he passed the Act of Supremacy. With this, all prominent members of the clergy had to accept Henry's new position, turning their backs on the Pope. Henry also made changes to the treason laws in England, and with this he categorised a large number of crimes in which someone could be executed for. At one point it was treason to criticise the king and also his heirs, and many accused the king of great heresy because of the changes he made to the church. Many across England accepted the changes wisely, and regarded the king as the ultimate authority over religion in England. But there were a number who could not accept this, for example Bishop John Fisher and Sir Thomas More, who were ultimately executed for their refusal to support Henry VIII in his changes. Thomas More was the king's own chancellor, and a man considered a close friend of the king, but his refusal to accept the king as the supreme head of the church, and also Anne Boleyn's marriage to the king, led to him being sentenced to death. More was executed on Tower Hill and was then beheaded, but Henry did regret the killing. More was very outspoken against the king, and said he could not deny the Pope's power, and if he did his soul would be damned to hell. Robert Hobbes, the Abbot of Woburn Abbey, actually sided with the king, which was strange, considering a number of abbots, including the Abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, were harder to convince. This was initially smart, as Henry VIII took brutal action against those who did not accept the changes to the church. In June 1534, the Friars of Richmond refused to accept Henry as the head of the church, and with this the king ordered 2 carts full of friars to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Later the Carthusian monks were also killed for the same offence, but Robert Hobbes was worried about the persecutions that were taking place across England, and he found these upsetting. The persecutions of prominent Catholics continued, and many leaders of religious houses were brutally executed. Thomas Cromwell then became the Vicar General, and he was appointed as the king's number 2 in the church. He outlawed the power of all the bishops and then ordered inspections of monastic houses and abbeys. Cromwell then sent out a number of his investigators to look at different religious buildings and houses, and they had 86 questions designed to trick monks and abbots. If they stumbled on one question, then Cromwell would seize the abbey and the wealth and shut it down. The Act for the Dissolutions of the Monasteries gave Cromwell the authority to shut down any religious house in England that initially had an income less than £200 a year. The King and Cromwell would then take all of the money from shutting down the house and would often sell the land cheap to raise money for Henry VIII's European wars, which were costing a large sum of money. The monasteries were seen as very wealthy, and Cromwell did find that some houses did contain poor behaviour. One abbot, for example, was found in bed with a woman at 11 o'clock in the morning, when he was supposed to be celibate. One abbot was also found guilty of selling the valuables of the abbey and pocketing the profits for himself, and another was described as the drunkest knave in England. Cromwell then took possession of the houses and orders, kicked out the monks and nuns, and then sold off the land cheaply to merchants and nobles. The Dissolutions of the Monasteries was one of the most savage and largest land grabs in English history, and it made the king incredibly rich again. But it ruined the lives of many people, with monks and nuns left homeless. Some were given a measly pension to look after themselves, but as inflation hit the country, this meant they were incredibly poor. Those who refused to give over the abbey were often met with harsher punishments, but the story of Robert Hobbes, the Abbot of Woburn Abbey, was rather different. He was safe as he sided initially with the king, but as time went on he became more hostile towards Henry VIII, especially with regards to his treatment of others. Cromwell then in 1537 sent out his investigators again to Woburn, and they asked the local people about the abbot. One man, a former friar, accused Robert Hobbes of being a supporter of the rebels who were protesting against Henry VIII. Hobbes was then brought in for interview and was asked to apologise to the king. It was said that during his interrogation that Hobbes held firm, although in some places it's difficult to establish an exact meaning from the long and rambling depositions of a man physically ill from strangury, and to disentangle apologies for bluntness of speech from repentance on point of principle. It is certain, however, that to the very end he remained opposed to the suppressions of the monasteries, the distribution of wretched heretic books by Cromwell, and the royal divorce, all sufficient to make his conviction a formality. Indeed, he confessed his offences and offered no defence. So Hobbes was considered ill, and it's clear his opinion on the dissolutions of the monasteries and Henry VIII had changed. But because of this, Robert Hobbes was sentenced to death for treason, and was hanged, drawn and quartered. This was very brutal. Then Hobbes was dragged through the streets on a hurdle in a local town in front of a large crowd. Many of the onlookers had respect for him, and he was then taken to a scaffold where he was hanged until almost dead, before he would then be cut down. But to add insult to injury for Robert Hobbes, he was taken outside of his own abbey, Woburn, and was then taken to an oak tree at the abbey's gates. He was hanged from this tree until almost dead, and was then cut down. He was then disemboweled and his entrails and insides were cut out and then burned in a fire next to a scaffold, before he was then beheaded and cut into 4 pieces. His remains were then sent to 4 different towns, and his head was probably placed above Woburn Abbey, his former house. After this, the king seized control of the abbey and all the lands. But Robert Hobbes is the forgotten abbot of the dissolutions of the monasteries, who suffered greatly, despite initially being in favour of the king's changes. But Henry VIII continued over the following years, and many people in England were executed up until the day he died. There is a reason why Henry VIII is known for his executions, and Robert Hobbes was one of his most sorrowful victims. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.